So we know from our reading that an externality is a cost or a benefit imposed on somebody outside the market, right? So a negative externality is a cost that is borne by somebody who's not even part of the market. So not the person making the decision to buy, not the person making the decision to produce, but somebody else. So like secondhand smoke is a classic example of a negative externality. The smoker decides to buy the cigarettes, the cigarette producer decides to sell the cigarettes, but the consumption of that good generates an externality on people that weren't part of that decision at all. And so the issue with negative externalities, so the first question is, what are they? We kind of have understood what they are. But the issue is, if we're talking about externalities as a reason for government intervention into the market, the question is, what is the problem? And then the next question, of course, is what can the government do to help? So with externalities, the problem is, well, with negative externalities, the problem is you're imposing a cost on somebody. You are making a decision, but your decision also has a cost on other people that aren't part of the market. And if nobody's making you take that cost into account, you're not taking it into account. So it might make sense for you to purchase the good, and it might make sense for the suppliers to purchase the good, but from a society-wide perspective, you and the supplier getting together and making that production and consumption decision aren't taking into account this external cost. And so from a society-wide perspective, maybe you're doing too much of that. So for instance, let's think about pollution. And so, because that's a classic negative externality, right? You're a firm, you're making something, and then you just dump all your waste in the river that flows past your factory. And that's the cheapest way for you to get rid of your waste. And so you get rid of your waste that way, you sell your product to the consumers who are buying it. Meanwhile, that waste is flowing down the river, harming everybody downstream, increasing their cost of doing business. Let's say there's a fishery downstream and all the fish are dead. Or just there's another firm downstream that uses the water from the river. And now that it's all polluted with your stuff, when the water comes to them, they have to pay money to clean it up. So you're imposing this cost on people that aren't even part of this market. You're producing, you're selling your output. Meanwhile, you're sending your toxic waste down the river for other people to deal with. And so you can think about this as, when we talk about the supply curve shows the marginal cost and the demand curve shows the marginal benefit, the willingness to pay. These are, I'm going to put a little emphasis here, private. The private marginal benefit, the private marginal cost, meaning the marginal benefit that accrues to the people that are consuming in the market, and the marginal cost that accrues to the people that are actually producing in the market. And so you leave the private market alone, it finds its way to equilibrium, as we know about. Typically, that's good. Typically, that's efficient. All the units with a marginal benefit, more than they cost to make, are made, and that would be the socially efficient level of output in a normal market. The difference is when the production and consumption of this good generates negative externalities, there's not just the cost of producing it, there is also the cost, and we could say this is the private production cost. So that's the cost that the supplier incurs to produce the good. But then there is also an external cost. So if we add that in, that you're producing this good, but production of that good is generating an external cost on those firms downstream, or the people breathing your smoke, or whatever negative externality is that you're generating. It's generating this external cost. So the true marginal cost to society is that private cost plus the external cost. And don't get too hung up on equations and lines and things. Just think about it conceptually, right? There's a cost to actually make the stuff, but then you're also imposing this additional cost on those, in our example, those downstream people that are dealing with your waste product. And so even though these units may be worth it to make, if you just think about the benefit to the people consuming them, and the cost of people producing them, they're worth it to make. But if you add in the cost to everybody else also, you can see the efficient level of output is actually lower. We'll call this the socially efficient level of output. Remember, the efficient level of output is where all the units that are worth more than they cost to make are made. And the height of the demand curve, the marginal benefit curve, shows what they're worth. This shows what they cost the producer to make. So you leave the market alone and it would produce here, which would be efficient if this good didn't generate negative externalities. But because it does, the marginal cost is up here. And so we have the true marginal cost to society says these units from QSE to Q star private, they're worth more to consumers than they cost producers to make. So if you leave the market alone, they're going to make them. But they're worth less to consumers than the true cost to society when you take into account not just the cost to produce, but also those external costs that are being generated. And so these units from Q socially efficient to the Q star private, they're being made when you leave the market alone, even though they shouldn't. The negative externality, so the free market output is greater than the socially efficient level of output. That's the problem when you have a negative externality. If you leave the market alone, it's going to produce more than society wants. Think about it conceptually. If you leave the market alone, you're saying, we're just going to look at our costs and our benefits. If no one's forcing us to look at those other costs and benefits, why would we? And so if you leave the market alone, you get here, but the true cost to society is higher. So the actually socially efficient level of output, where only units that are worth more than the total cost to everyone in society, the producers and everyone dealing with the negative externality, the pollution that's being generated, that level of output is lower. So in the presence of a negative externality, the market's producing too much. You leave the market alone. If you think about it conceptually, if you leave the market alone, they're not taking into account all the costs. They're taking into account the benefits, but they're not taking into account all the costs. And when you take into account all the costs, some of those units that were worth it to produce are no longer worth it. And that is the issue, why when you leave markets alone, and they would in other cases be efficient, in the presence of a negative externality, they're going to produce more than the socially efficient level of output.